Hey everybody, this is kind of a supplemental film to my evolution versus creationism as it applies to law. And this is just kind of a side train of thought that came to me today as I was reading some news articles. And it's not necessarily uh, pertinent to that law thing, but it goes more on to show some of the dangers of the evolutionary type of thinking, or at least brings it into a different light. But we'll start off with Greece's the situation in Greece and end up with Kirlian photography. So, as most people know, the situation in the eurozone is very volatile, as is the United States, and essentially globally, with the exception of a few Asian countries. People even say China's kind of crazy. So everyone's in debt, and everyone's printing money to get out of debt. And they print the money to bail out things, and so really that's a market manipulation. But in the case of Greece, Greece, with the money that they owe with respect to their government's decisions a few years back, a la Goldman Sachs, now they're being implemented with austerity measures. And austerity measures is a fancy way of saying we're going to have a fire sale on some of the things in your country, and you're also going to pay more taxes. So that's likely a scenario that's going to unfold for Greece and for any country that leaves or is in trouble within the Eurozone, particularly Italy, Portugal, Ireland, and Spain. So if you look at that, it comes into question with law because now you're losing your sovereignty. What was once a sovereign nation like Greece is now essentially a debt slave, or they'll become a debt slave. That's unless they can get out of it, unless they can pull off something like they've done in Ireland. So the reason why I wanted to mention that is because as we're seeing today in the markets in the United States, there's a tremendous amount of market manipulation. And what we're finding out, mostly that's by design. But the truth is, you can't manipulate the market because the market, people would argue, is a natural system. And in that natural organic system, if something doesn't work, it inherently falls to the wayside, allowing for something new to emerge. And so, but what we have is we have the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world manipulating currencies, trying to get the numbers they want, but in the end, essentially, they're just inflating the currencies and arguably to a hyperinflationary type of thing. But the point is, people say that because of that manipulation, the markets will come back in full swarm and crush them. Not sure how, but maybe the point is that they'll fail because they can't manipulate it. So I was listening to an interview on the Conscious Media Network. Michael Tsarian, if you know him, he does a lot of examination of the consciousness of the human being today, and his study has led him through a lot of historical work and information. So if you haven't ever heard of him, check him out. But he made a comment today in this interview that people are doing the same thing with consciousness, and that the human being has a fractured consciousness, and it's being manipulated into a state of fear through a series of fracturings. And the problem is you're trying to outthink nature and the natural occurrence of what a human psyche may be. Now, I'm not saying he's right. I'm not saying that earlier the whole aspect of the central banks, what they're doing is right or wrong. I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm just trying to show a thread of similarities. So we're starting out with market manipulation and how it's leading to a global financial crisis. And then we're talking about Michael Tsarian and how he has talked about a crisis in consciousness due to the manipulation of consciousness and how nature will come back and in full swing. I often go to a website called Red Ice Creations. They have some pretty neat interviews there, some different people. And the article he had on there today was Get Ready for a New Human Species. And apparently this eugenics program, and eugenics is essentially the applied science or the biosocial movement, which advocates use of practices aimed at improving the genetic composition of a population. This article had to deal with the mention of a gentleman, Juan Enriquez, who had come out on a program called TED, which I'll show you here in a second, and some of the stuff that's going on in genetics. I'll just read a few paragraphs of it here real quickly. It says, if some of the information emerging from the technology, governmental, and academic worlds are any indication, not only is the police state here, the scientific dictatorship is right around the corner. Indeed, if recent comments made by Juan Enriquez are indicative of the coming state merger between technology and genetics, we have much to be concerned about. Now, obviously, this person's writing from an alarmist standpoint, and I'm not saying he's right or wrong, just showing it to you. This guy Enriquez has a resume that's pretty astonishing, to even include the visiting committee of Dave Rockefeller Center, Harvard's Dave Rockefeller Center. So Rockefeller is synonymous with eugenics all the way back in the time. And the point is, Rockefeller is a self-appointed global elitist, saying that, well, we got here first, therefore we can tell the world what to do, how to do it, etc. So that's kind of going back to my video on evolution, the downside to evolution, the evolutionary concept, and I call it the limited evolutionary model, because they aren't seeing, they're not aligning it with anything other than essentially the materialistic aspect of the human being. So here he says, the new human species is one that begins to engineer the evolution of viruses, plants, animals, and itself. As we do that, Darwin's rules get significantly bent and sometimes even broken. By taking direct and deliberate control over our evolution, we are living in a world where we are modifying stuff according to our desires. Question is, whose desires? A committee's desires? An elite's desires? Is everybody participating in establishing those desires? So anyway, I'll put the link to this video down below so you can look at it. But it's a pretty good read as far as getting exposed to some of this stuff. And it talks about eugenics and how they come up with interesting words to downplay that, such as racial hygiene, or now it's called social biology, family planning. And that replaces abortion and sterilization. So whether you know it or not, our government's been messing with people of the United States for a very long time. But here's one thing I'll share with you last in this article, though. It says, this time, of course, well, in light of the increase in propaganda masquerading as science and being peddled by science superstars like Enriquez, there is no doubt the world's population is being prepped for a eugenics-based future. This time, of course, the system will be assisted by a much more sophisticated technological machine, and thus a much more efficient system of eugenics. After years of nonstop television, media repetition, and experts who tout the benefits of merging man and machine, as well as the cost of inheriting inferior genes, there is also little doubt that the world's population will march into this future, that they will march into this future willingly. So what I'd like to say is here, it's the cost of inheriting inferior genes. So let's say instead of going to school now, your kids, instead of having to get vaccines, they have to get their genes mapped. And then when they do, though, they find out that, well, you know what, you have inferior genes. Therefore, you need to go to a different type of school. I'm just speculating, but that's the insinuation here, and especially when used with the word cost of inheriting inferior genes. Reminds me of that that movie Gattaca, I think, or something like that. So anyway, here's Juan Enriquez on TED, and I'll just play a little portion of it.
I'm supposed to scare you. This is about fear, right? And you should be really afraid, but not for the reasons why you think you should be. You should be really afraid that if we stick up the first slide on this thing, there we go, that you're missing out. Because if you spend this week thinking about Iraq and thinking about Bush and thinking about the stock market, you're going to miss one of the greatest adventures that we've ever been on.
This is 2003, by the way.
And this is what this adventure is really about. This is crystallized DNA. Every life form on this planet, every insect, every bacteria, every plant, every animal, every human, every politician. It's coded in that stuff. And if you want to take a single crystal of DNA, it looks like that. And we're just beginning to understand this stuff. And this is the single most exciting adventure that we have ever been on. It's the single greatest mapping project we've ever been on. If you think that the map of the Americas made a difference, or landing on the moon, or this other stuff, it's the map of ourselves and the map of every plant, and every insect, and every bacteria that really makes a difference. And it's beginning to tell us a lot about evolution. It turns out that what this stuff is, and Richard Dawkins has written about this, is really a river out of Eden. So the 3.2 billion base pairs inside each of your cells is really...
Okay, I think I'll show you the next part too. So this is now a leap I'm making.
And it's all coming out of things that look like this. These are companies that didn't exist 5 years ago. Huge gene sequencing facilities, size of football fields. Some are public, some are private. Takes about $5 billion to sequence a human being the first time. Takes about $3 million the second time. We will have a $1,000 genome within the next 5 to 8 years. That means each of you will contain, on a CD, your entire gene code. And it will be really boring. It will read like this. The really neat thing about this stuff is that's life. And Lori's going to talk about this one a little bit. Because if you happen to find this one inside your body, you're in big trouble, because that's the source code for Ebola. That's one of the deadliest diseases known to humans. But plants work the same way, and insects work the same way, and this apple works the same way. This apple is the same thing as this floppy disk. Because this thing codes ones and zeros, and this thing codes ATCGs, and it sits up there absorbing energy on a tree. And one fine day, it has enough energy to say, execute, and it goes, right? And when it does that, pushes .exe, what it does is it executes the first line of code, which reads just like that, AATCAGGACCC, and that means make a root. Next line of code, make a stem. Next line of code, TACGGG, make a flower that's white, that blooms in the spring, that smells like this. In the measure that you have the code, in the measure that you can read it, and by the way, the first plant was read 2 years ago. First human was read 2 years ago. First insect was read 2 years ago. First thing we ever read was in 1995, a little bacteria called Haemophilus influenzae.
All right, so the point is he's essentially equating DNA sequencing to code ones and zeros on a disk. And what I thought was, first thing I thought of, or one of the first things I thought of was, well, if that's so, you know, what about this? And what you're looking at here is a leaf. And what the shine you see around it is actually energy. And a gentleman, I think a team, a husband and wife, came up with a process. Their names were Semyon and Valentina Kirlian. They discovered this controversial form of photography back in 1939, where essentially they run energy, electricity through something living or through an object, and then take a picture of it. And essentially, or ultimately, that ended up in people taking photographs of their auras. But in this example here, what they did is they took a living leaf, took it off a tree, and then they snipped off a portion of the leaf and put it down, subjected it to the photography method. And the interesting thing is it still had a memory right here of the portion of its body or its structure that had been removed. So very odd, because it still has a electrical memory of its being, of itself, of its essence. And I guess I'm in my mind trying to equate that to ones and zeros. So I think if anything, this world's more magical than we know, and we'll see what the future has in store for us.